Good afternoon. It's 12:05. Probably waking some of you up after lunch. It looks like I startled a few people. So the way that you are seated actually reminds me of a perfect infographic for spreading yourself too thin. It's like way on the left side, and it's kind of how I feel some days. And I'm sure a lot of you do as well. So welcome to Protecting Financial Data Through Cyber and Fraud Risk Identification. My name is Michael Dean. I have to my left my colleagues in our Enterprise Risk Management Organization, Dr. Linda Wilbanks, who is a senior advisor for Enterprise Cyber Risk Management, and Ms. Linda Hall, who is a senior advisor for Fraud Risk Management. And just not to go too far into our backgrounds here, but I haven't always been with the federal government. I came from the private sector most recently in the financial services, more specifically from the fintech space, dealing with payments platforms and mobile-based payments. However, I spent nearly 25 years in the academy as a professor, as an associate dean, as an administrator. So I've been on your side. And like the Undersecretary, Dr. Jones, said this morning, she knows the hard work that each of you do and the complexities that come with trying to comply with regulations and mandates, and having to be the person that's trying to run all of the trains in your office without stepping over lines. And you're probably worried each day if, did you do anything personally that would cause you any liability? Did you put your institution at risk? And you're just trying to keep the trains going with getting students aid, at the same time. And so I understand how complex and how difficult your jobs might be. And so I'm not coming at this from a regulation side of things. I'm really trying to discuss with you from an operating perspective and from my experience in the academy. To my left, Dr. Wilbanks, who you can read more about her biography later once you get the slides, but she has a long history in cybersecurity. She's been a CIO, a Chief Information Security Officer at both Federal Student Aid, at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, for the U.S. Nuclear Program and the Department of Energy, and for NCIS. And I often ask Linda, is it like the television show? Does she actually go out on investigations and such? And she just said, I can't tell you that. And Ms. Hall, who initiated what is a new initiative last year of taking a look at fraud risk across the enterprise. And she has embarked on what we're trying to do is get a better handle on what fraud risk actually exists and how do we respond to those risks. So she has a lot of work ahead of her and has already partnered with the IG on a lot of fronts. So I'll let Linda talk more about that later. But both Dr. Wilbanks and Ms. Hall are senior executive service employees with the federal government. That means that they have a pretty high status, have a long history of providing value in the federal space. And we do have some of our folks who are helping us, I see in the audience today. If you're from FSA or the Department of Education, would you mind raising a hand or standing so folks know that? This is Jason Gray, the department CIO, sitting up front here. And we have Steve Raley in the middle section back there. Steve, can you raise your hands? He's helping our fraud risk group as well. But he's also aligned with our business operations and helping transforming our servicing environment. So really, what you see on the slides today, those are our three objectives. This presentation is really about where the rubber meets the road with what you do. And that's what Dr. Wilbanks and Ms. Hall will cover. It's basic cybersecurity, and she will provide you with some information on how to identify risks and potentially just alert you to maybe different ways to respond to them or answer your questions to that respect. And the same with fraud with Ms. Hall. What I'm trying to do today as a preface to those discussions is talk with you a little bit about risk management and enterprise risk management and the roles that you play, because it's not a topic that probably you think about often or see yourselves participating in at the institution. But I think it's one that you might want to take back with you and really take a reflective look at your institution and ask yourselves, do we really do a good job at risk management? And then as you further drill down, do we really do a good job with really managing our cyber and fraud risks? So what you will not see on this slide is really a model in risk management called the 3 lines of defense. And so I'm letting you know this today because it might help you conceptualize where you fit in at your institution, especially when it comes to your day-to-day activities and your critical involvement in actually being a mitigation force or a response to cybersecurity risks and fraud risks that your institution faces. Well, in risk management, the concept of 3 lines of defense are that the first line are the people that handle the day-to-day work, the people who are on the front lines doing the battle, responding to the risk or issues that are happening at your institution. If you, for example, I don't know if many of you have read about the potential fraud case or the fraud case that was reported where a human being at an institution, probably one of your colleagues, spotted similarly written envelopes that were mailed in by a fraudster trying to gain, financial aid for courses that they didn't even plan to take. Anyone familiar with that scenario? A few people over here. Well, it has had some headlines, and so that's an example where humans have had a very critical intervention in intercepting potential fraud. So you play a huge role every day with each and every decision you make over every piece of data that you deal with. And I'm sure that you know that already. I recently read in EdTech magazine that in 2017, and I don't know how accurate this is, but the fraud with federal financial aid has increased by 103%. Is that right? Is that right about that, Linda? And just for 2017 alone. And over a 3-year period, another magazine reported that cybersecurity or data breaches have cost almost $200 million over a 3-year period between 2009, 2012, or 2012, 2014. I forget the date, but I have some of those references that I read just the other day. So, and that number is not expected to decrease necessarily unless we really get sophisticated in doing some things about it. So these 2 topics are very important topics to cover, and the jobs that you do every day, it's a very critical part of how we defend against those losses in both of those areas. So those of you who are paying very close attention and take that as a serious part of your job, that is what we call our first line of defense. And so from FSA's perspective, I want to thank you for what it is that you do and how you work with us to get those things done. So the second line of defense is what you call a risk management operation. It is the collective set of practices and tools that you use to respond to a risk before it becomes an issue. So the difference between a risk and an issue is something that has happened that you're dealing with, and a risk is essentially a level of uncertainty about an event. It's not all negative, but in this case of a data breach, that would be negative, right? It's like, okay, what if we had a data breach, what would we do, right? What are the causes of data breach? So those what if questions about uncertainties in both the cyber security or data breach areas and with the fraud areas, it's what you call risk thinking. You're thinking about the uncertainties and the policies and procedures and controls and actions that you would have in place that could either mitigate those in advance or reduce the risk of those happening, or having an action plan in place that you could respond to or treat those risks very quickly. So risk management, the second line of defense, brings some discipline around that way of thinking and provides tools and training and a little bit of oversight to make sure that the first line actors, which is you in the financial aid arena, it might be someone else in the finance office for financial concerns, although they have some of the same data responsibilities, right? So they're the frontline operators. What the risk management folks would do is make sure they have the tools, the training, the templates to work with, the challenging oversight to make sure that you've captured everything in a disciplined way to see if you're going through what-if scenarios to treat those risks. And the third line of defense is the auditors. Sometimes it's an internal auditor, sometimes it's an external auditor, and you know what they do. They come and check you out for compliance and try to find things to hammer on you, right? They try to find something. And we all know we've dealt with auditors who they've got to find at least one thing, right? Sometimes they don't have anything to find, but they've got to find at least one thing. But really, that's set up as an entity's third line of defense. Can we do a deeper dive audit and see if we're complying with all of our policies and by our own internal controls, or if internal controls exist that really help mitigate the risks in several different areas, including the two we'll talk about today. The reason I wanted to expand more on risk management at institutions is because just through my own observation and experiences and personal research, I've noticed that there's a paucity, a gap in the actual second line of defense practices at institutions, that a lot of institutions don't have a disciplined risk management practice that helps you feel confident and that you're managing your risks on a day-to-day basis. They just kind of leave that up to you, and you go about your days and you don't know if you're actually doing a best in business practice or not. You're just doing the best you can to serve students and to try to respond to the risks that you think are there. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to present a little bit of a conceptual notionality about risk management, so you can reflect on your institutions, and as you look up through the governance of your institutions, you can ask yourselves, do we really have some good risk management practices in place? So the first thing before I get to that, what I've done in a presidential meeting before is really acknowledge the increased complexity that is presented to college presidents today to manage the institutions enterprise-wide. In fact, the American Council on Education in 2018 reported that college presidents find themselves in a setting today that is unprecedented in its complexity. And you'll notice the arrows, they go from, well over 20 years ago. It's my little graphic to show the increased, this trifecta here of complexity, accountability for institutional leadership and governance, and visibility. For example, we had an institution on the West Coast who had a big data breach not too long ago. I think we all know what that is. We had a situation with Penn State, who was, they were fined $2.4 million for a Clary Act violation. Does anyone recall that? It's a pretty big fine. So because of the visibility and the increased complexity and accountability that presidents have to deal with, when those things happen, it really impacts the reputation of the university in a very negative way, wouldn't you say? Yeah. So who is the first person that the court of public opinion wants to fry whenever these issues come about? President, right? Nowadays, through the media, the president's leadership is always questioned no matter what issue it is that we're dealing with, whether it be a breach, whether it be fraud, whether it be a Clary Act violation. This was not really the case about 20 years ago, but because of the heightened visibility, it is now. And so some of my advice to college presidents is, look, today, I don't think your institution's reputation or your personal leadership reputation can afford for you as a president not to be more versed in cybersecurity acumen. So in other words, think about this explanation. We have Akron College in Ohio. I don't even know if there's an Akron College. I'm just making that up, in Ohio. And the president says, let's just say the financial aid office is doing the best job as possible. Somebody emails a spreadsheet of information. There's a data breach. Some bad actors hacked into a system, use the data to create fake IDs and somehow effectuate financial aid fraud in some way. So this becomes, public in the media. And so someone from the media or someone from a compliance office asked the president, hey, what are your risk management practices around protecting your data? Do you have a disciplined risk management operation around your data? How did this happen? And the president responds, I was so busy fundraising and so busy working with enrollment, I just pushed that to my CIO. right? CIOs have a very important job now, don't get me wrong. But think about that response in terms of a tone at the top presidential leadership response, as opposed to saying, yes, I've met with my CIO and my cabinet, and I understand exactly the risks that we have at our institutions regarding data breaches, and we have put all the best in business responses in place that would mitigate the risk. So we are, and the president knows exactly the amount of risk that was accepted with this data and what was put in place. So you have a much more knowledgeable president, in this case, working in partnership with the CIO and with all of the offices across the institution, rather than someone who chooses to pass the responsibility to other areas in the silo. So that was a little bit of my advice when talking with, and it's non-prescriptive, it's just what I've learned by being in the academy for a long time. So 20, 30 years ago, that was just it. Presidents only had to worry about fundraising, carrying on the institutional tradition, planning a budget, physical plant, routine compliance. Nowadays, because of the visibility and the accountability, a lot of institutions are facing fiscal solvency, some because of business model disruptors from educational opportunities or higher educational training opportunities that are taking students away from the traditional higher education market, sort of like coding boot camps and such, and other avenues through which some folks can get higher ed training. Plus, you have this notionality that this question of, is higher education worth it to some folks? So that question is really being asked, does everybody need a college degree like we were all told in kindergarten, right? So in fact, I'll share a LinkedIn post with you from a colleague of mine who's a CEO of a wealth management company. He said, here's another list of companies that no longer require a college degree. Apple was one, Google was one, Ernst & Young in the UK was one. And there's a list of several of them, right, for management positions. And then the CEO commented that while some degrees or some jobs should take a college degree, for example, if you're in biomedical research or something like that, other ones may not, like in the tech industry. It's just the right amount of training. And he goes on to say, so we have this tradition of higher ed institutions selling products and strapping students with debt that's unpayable. And so I disagree with him in some respects, and some of the comments were half agreed, half disagreed. And but I can see the point, because if you listen to Secretary DeVos's talk during the first day, the opening session, debt is a real problem that we have to have an honest conversation about. So, and these types of conversations are starting to bubble up. So college presidents have a real business model issue to deal with as well. Cybersecurity is one of these areas now that is really focused upon, because data has value. As you'll learn from Dr. Wilbanks later, there is no meaningless data, or there is no data that's worth nothing. Data is always worth something. And there's a lot of bad actors out there, and with the knowledge set of how to hack into systems and all sorts of other technology skills, which I won't go into detail on, really it's hard to stay ahead of those folks. But it's one of the things that's probably, and as you'll see later, Risk and Insurance magazine in 2018 listed cybersecurity as one of the major issues that institutions will have to deal with. And fraud too, from that respect, because fraud is so linked to a cyber vehicle that they're almost inseparable a little bit, although the notionality of fraud, of stealing money in some way, and I guess you could have fraud and stealing data too, is slightly different than system vulnerability issues, right? But where data ties in, and slightly different than privacy issues, where your system vulnerability, perhaps your risk posture, your system vulnerability position really impacts your data privacy risk too. I think it's all related. So there's the sexual assault concerns, the Clary Act responses that presidents have to be accountable for. That's really, in public's eye. The evolving compliance. So this is Risk and Insurance. Their top 7 risks were that fiscal solvency, athletic concussion injury is for college institutions, sexual assault, gender equality issues, erosion of public trust, campus crisis readiness. Again, we've seen natural disasters with the hurricanes, with the wildfires out west, and so which leads me to ask, does an institution have a really good second line of defense program to help the folks on the ground who are doing the day-to-day work and responding to risks? Were they really prepared for these crises? And you'll find out, Dr. Wilbanks will touch on it a little bit, that natural disaster has a real impact on your cybersecurity posture. I mean, because you have to have some resilience to maintain your systems, right? They have to keep going even though your school is shut down. And did your institution appropriately deal with those risks ahead of time? So I'll skip this one. I mentioned a few of those. So in a nutshell, you see all of these different areas that pertain to your university, cybersecurity included and fraud, accreditation, board and governance, athletics, Title IX sexual assault things, campus safety. So all of these risks here, or risk within those areas, a president has to really balance out. Now, what would we like? We would like the institutions, the presidents and their board to, if we accepted no risk, zero risk in cybersecurity or zero risk in data breaches, meaning we're going to try to be 100% confident that we will never ever be hacked, we will never ever lose data, then we would put 100% of our resources, we would close down our athletic programs, we would close down our marketing for enrollment management, we would shut down anything we have to do with much campus safety at all and put all of our resources in cybersecurity, right? But we can't do that. Just like we can't put all of our money into campus safety. We would have a camera in every room, a fence around the university perhaps. I had a president say yesterday when I asked him, what keeps you awake at night? What do you really, really worry about? And so he's at a college that's not in a great geographic area that has a lot of crime around it, and he said, and it's a private college, really good college, and he said, besides funding enrollment, and now after the secretary's speech, me really thinking about how much debt my students are getting into, because he's a private college president, he said, the next thing is campus safety. He said, when I first got there, he said, and I really struggled with this, I wanted to put this fence around the entire university so you could have a gate to drive in or walk through. He said, but the kind of fence I wanted to build, which was really kind of a wall, was really sending the wrong message, and it would not invite the kind of applicants into my school any longer that I wanted to get in. I said, so what you're saying is you accepted some risk in keeping your students safe. He said, yeah, I guess I did, because I thought that would keep out a lot of the crime, but I couldn't afford to invest in it to keep my other programs going. So that's the trade-off, and that's the enterprise aspect that a second line of defense would work with the first line of defense folks and really helping a president decide where are we going to allocate our money to minimize our risks across the enterprise. And that's where I would really have suggested to some presidents that, look, you may have a good CIO, but leadership starts at the top, and you have to become well-versed and develop an acumen and an understanding of what your financial aid administrators are going through to defend against cyber threats, right? So, and you have to be very well prepared and know what you're doing to mitigate those risks of cyber attack, just like you would a Clary event, or just like you would in athletics, mediocre season, right? Presidents learn financial statements, they learn endowments, they learn what it's like to have a winning basketball team or football team, and sometimes they press cybersecurity directly siloed up in the CIO. So I think that we're in a time that the presidents have to become really, really aware of what they're doing to treat their cyber risk and how they're investing in their risk management. So some basic terms, we already went through this. What is a risk? A risk is the possibility that events will occur and affect the achievement of a strategy or business objective. So it's not an issue yet. It's a risk. It's an uncertainty, right? So you have to deal with the uncertainty. So when the issues do arise, you're confident, you have an action plan, and you know you've put in place best in business practices to deal with those things. So what's risk management? It's a series of coordinated activities to direct and control threats to achieving those objectives. One of your objectives is to have no data breaches, right? Because that brings the best value to your institution and protects against reputational harm and actual harm to the students who lose that data. And so what is enterprise risk management? It's as simple as saying it's the culture, the capabilities, the practices integrated across the institution that is meant to really help your leadership and you drive performance to the expected outcomes. So it seeks to take an organization-wide approach to understand how a university is allocating its resources. Is it allocating it enough to the financial aid office to protect against cyber threats, or is it not? Right? It's a disciplined approach that tries to look across the enterprise. And I'll skip that. And one thing I wanted to leave you with before I turn it over to Dr. Wilbanks, or a couple of different things, is one, this statement that was put out by the Department of Homeland Security, I think it's really relevant and it fits over all organizations. One thing it says that executives at the top are really responsible for the risks of the enterprise, including cybersecurity. That means the president and board ultimately are the accountable parties for their cyber risks, in addition to all the other risks. So here are 5 questions that presidents and CEOs, this is from the Department of Homeland Security, it's not mine, it's DHS's, and you can ask yourself, do you ask this of your department? Do executives at your institution ask these questions? Does your president ask these questions? Perhaps they should, perhaps we all should. So what is the current level and business impact of cyber risk to our institution? That means, have we really assessed, if we had a data breach, what it would cost our institution in reputation, what it would cost the people who were harmed, the students, what it would cost internally to remedy those breaches, what it would cost to respond to compliance, what it would cost in terms of your eligibility for Title IV. How is our executive leadership informed about current business impact on cyber risk? How are they informed? Is there a process at your university to help you communicate those risks upward and to help your administration or your university's cabinet to deal with the risks at your level? Is there or is there not a disciplined process? How does your cybersecurity program apply best practices? How comprehensive is your cyber incident response plan? And how often is that plan tested? From the executive level, do you have anyone at your university that's responsible for really testing the what-if scenarios? So this is what I'll leave you with before we get to Dr. Wilbanks. And these are just general questions about risk management practices at your institution. And ultimately, if you look at on the left, it's the board and president that all of the accountability for the risk roll up to. So does your institution have a risk management program that you know of? Are you engaged in risk conversations with your senior administrators? Does your institution provide tools and training to help you manage those risks and communicate those risks upward? Has your institution assigned responsibility to a key executive or group to drive a risk management process? And is your entire organization involved in some type of disciplined risk management and assessment process, including your cyber risks and fraud risks? So I'll hand this over to Dr. Linda Wilbanks, who will get down into the details of cyber risk management, but I wanted to leave you with just a notionality that maybe you go back to your institutions, think about, does my institution have a disciplined and organized risk management practice that would support our best ability to manage our cyber and fraud risks? And just begin thinking about those. Usually with groups of financial aid administrators, we can talk about risk management, but at the end of a session, all of the questions, and and I wouldn't blame you a bit because this is what you deal with day to day. Go directly to operating procedures. What's the procedure for, handling a ransomware thing? What's the procedure for, if we get an email and I know someone sent an email with data unencrypted, what are we supposed to do with it at that point? What's my response? So those are the types of operating questions that really get down to the granular level, which are things that you need to know. But I really wanted you to get a concept of where you fit in the overall risk management process and maybe what it is or is not your institution doing that could help you perform at your best level to manage all of your cyber risks and fraud risks. All right, Dr. Wilbanks.
Good afternoon. We're going to talk about IT cybersecurity, a topic that really impacts every one of you. You all have an iPhone, you all have an iPad, you all have a computer. Therefore, you are part of the cyber risk, the cyber problem. Because the risk is associated with everything, with all types of computers, with all types of applications. You are the financial aid administrators. You hold the data of the students in your hands. You hold the data that the parents trusted you with. Therefore, it's imperative that you look at cybersecurity risks associated with how you handle that data, because we need to be very much aware of the confidentiality that we have to maintain of the data to make sure people don't see it that shouldn't see it. We need to make sure that the data integrity is maintained, that the data is not altered or changed. But cybersecurity cannot work in a vacuum. It's part of a much bigger picture. And let me tell you a story to demonstrate this. We're out in the jungle, and there's 5 blind men. Don't ask me why 5 blind men are wandering around the jungle. But they run across an elephant. And the first one touches the sides of the elephant and said, "We've hit a wall." The second one holds on to the tail, and he said, "But there's a rope attached to the wall." A third one is hugging one of the legs and said, "No, we're in a forest with very big trees." Another one touches the trunk and says, "But there's snakes on these trees." And a fifth one says, he's touching the tusk and he says, "But there's spears." When you look at an elephant in pieces, it's not an elephant, and you can't work with it as pieces. Cybersecurity risk management is the same thing. We have to work with it from an enterprise perspective. Cyber is critical, but we have to work within fraud. We have to work within the business units. So we have to work with it as a whole to be effective. One of these areas is your data, your networks. Everywhere in the country, we are prone to disasters. We weren't aware of how vulnerable we were. We thought we were safe in Virginia, and then we had an earthquake. New Jersey had Sandy. New Orleans had Katrina. All areas of the country are prone to natural disasters. Where's your data? What happens to your data when the water comes? What happens to your data when you can't access your networks? It is our job in cybersecurity risk management to ensure we identify these risks and we look at them as how are we going to resolve them. We need to know that in the event of any type of disaster, that our networks are secure. We have looked at the risk, we have managed the risk, and we know how we are going to continue supporting the students in the event that there is a natural disaster. We also have to look at the data. I don't know whether you've noticed, but students aren't real good about passwords. They share them, they post them, They put information on their Facebook page about where they went to high school, their security question, what their pet is, their pictures. So you and I, our job is to look at these risks that are presented by the data, for the data. And our job is to ensure that we are protecting the data against those risks. Now, I would love to put everything in a cocoon and not let anybody touch anything, but that's not practical. So we have to protect our data in such a way that it's still usable, because everybody has a role, a responsibility in cybersecurity risk management. And I want to emphasize risk management and IT operations work hand in hand. But there is a difference. We are partners. It's my job for cybersecurity risk management to help identify the risks, then work with the operations to put the mitigations in place. But we are a partnership. You all have a role. This diagram is part of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, one of the special publications that federal government is required to comply with. Notice you're in there. You're in there as business process level and senior executive level. As Michael said, it has to come from the top, and we have to support each other. The other thing we need to look at is that everybody has a role, and that includes our students. They have to take some responsibility, but also the parents, because many of them work with a FAFSA form, and the teachers, the administrators, everybody has a role. Whether we're dealing with the threats from internal and external, man-made or natural, intentional or accidental, all of these threats play a part in us determining from an enterprise perspective, how do we protect the data? How do we protect the networks to ensure the data is available? Now, you might think that it's just data. It's just pieces of data. I don't see everything. I only have a piece. But when you put those pieces together, they do tell a full picture about the students. As I said, the data can be sold, and it is of value, but it's your job, it's my job, to work to protect that data, and we need to do it across the enterprise. One of the things one way to protect the data is by passwords. Everybody hates passwords. You want me to change it every 3 months? 12 characters? I can't use one I've used for 2 years? Are you kidding me? So what do? You write it down on a sticky note and put it onto your keypad. That's really not very effective. It's not effective to put the sticky note on your calendar either. The point is, passwords are not meant to be shared. We all have students that work in financial aid offices. Passwords are not meant to be shared. They are our first line of defense. That's our first risk management, risk mitigation tool. We need to ensure that we, all of us, look at how can we mitigate the cybersecurity risks to protect the data that's been entrusted to us. That's the bottom line. You and I have been given the role to protect the students and the parents' information. Cybersecurity is a critical role in protecting the data. We need to work with the operational teams to ensure that we implement all of the requirements, all of the mitigations, and we work together. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Linda Hall so she can talk about the fraud risk.
It's hard to be last, you know? And no, I don't have a story about an elephant. But I do want to talk to you about the risk that is probably near and dear to all of our hearts, and that's the risk of fraud. And since I don't have a story about an elephant, I can borrow a quote from my old buddy Ben Franklin, who says, "There's no kind of dishonesty into which otherwise good people more easily and frequently fall than that of defrauding the government." Now, we're not going to talk about the government as a whole. We're going to try to keep it in the confines of what we deal with every day, and that's federal financial aid. Now, I know that you've heard throughout the course of this conference that we have close to a $1.5 trillion, with a T, trillion-dollar loan portfolio. That's a lot of money that some fraudsters would like to get into, would like to scurry around in, and would like to abscond some of it for their own nefarious uses. Now, fraud risk management actually is referred to in the regulations, and if you'll just give me a minute, I'm not going to assume that you all have committed 34 CFR 668.16 to memory, but if you'll indulge me for a few minutes, I'm going to read you what the preamble, what the first statement says. And at the beginning of this reg, it says, "To begin and to continue to participate in any Title IV HEA program, an institution shall demonstrate to the Secretary that the institution is capable of adequately administering that program under each of the standards established in this section." So one takeaway I want you to take home to your respective offices is 34 CFR 668.16, which are our standards of administrative capability, and you can see fraud is listed in the regs. So it's not something we make up. It's not something that everybody always pertains to immediately, but it is a standard that we, and I use that term very loosely, that we all have to live with. Why and what makes up fraud? Why do people even think about this? Well, there's several factors. We like to call it the fraud triangle. There's opportunity, there's motivation, and there's that rationalization. Opportunity, there's weak or ineffective controls. Think about your own office and what controls are in place. There's little or no oversight, and we hope that situation does not exist in your office. There's lax rules around the data that Dr. Wilbanks was referring to, and there's the opportunity for management override. And I'm sure the people in this room are very familiar with management override because you have discretion in your offices about some of the override capabilities of doing financial aid. Motivation, people get in debt over their head and they don't know how to get out. Some have addictions, whether it's drug addictions, alcohol addictions. They have a certain level of status that they want to maintain. They can't afford it. They turn to fraudulent activities. And then there's just old plain greed. They don't think that they can provide for their families, and they start to turn to nefarious activities. They say, well, why not? Everyone does it. They change their lifestyle. If you see someone around your campus, around your office, that all of a sudden is driving around in a BMW when they were formerly in a Ford Fiesta, you might want to look at that and say, where are you getting that money from? They say, well, I was only borrowing it, and you know what? I was underpaid and I deserve it. Those are some of the factors that might cause people to slip into that area of fraudulent activity and become one of the risk factors. So where are the fraud risks that could exist at your institution? Well, you're right here. School employees. You can go down the list. Lenders, guarantee agencies, contractors, students. If you don't see your name on this list, that's right, you're considered an other. So you're still considered a fraud risk. So keep that in mind. Now, what is fraud risk management in the context of what we've been talking about? There's controls in place that prevent fraud. That's to keep fraud from existing in the first place. And then there's controls in place that help you to detect. Now, there's also been a lot of conversation in this conference about verification. Well, you can think of verification in either of these categories. Verification could be used as a fraud prevention, because people may think one little step about, well, maybe I won't add this to the calculation of my estimated family contribution, because somebody might actually look at it and see that I don't have a zero-based EFC. So that would be in the preventative category. Or maybe it's detection, for as you go through and look at some of the applications that come through your office, you say, something just doesn't look right about this one. I'm going to call this one for verification because that's certainly within your purview. Internal controls are a very strong deterrent. I'm sure each of you in your office has controls in place to make sure that your operations are reliable, your financial reporting is reliable, and overall you're in compliance with all the laws and regulations required for distributing federal financial aid. Now, what could be some indicators? One person in control. Some of you may have very small financial aid offices, but you still should not be the only one that's signing things, designing things, putting out the last, because you could potentially be a fraud risk. No separation of duties, no prior audits, turnover. There's a lot of turnover in some financial aid offices. It's often where, and not to pick on them at all, work-study students are. They stay for a semester, they get access to a lot of information in those offices. And as Dr. Wilbanks was talking about, they're not really too cognizant of what to do with the passwords and the access that they have to a lot of our federal systems. They stay for a semester, they go. And again, I'm not trying to pick on the work-study students, but you all use them. And you know that they have a lot of information that's going through their hands that they may not even be aware of the sensitivity of the data that they're dealing with. Large amounts of payments in cash. I think we've gotten away from this for the most part because a lot of our funds are downloaded electronically. But still, if there's a lot of cash laying around, people may kind of pilfer some that says, I'm underpaid, I deserve this. Missing documentation. Altered records. At least we've gotten away, and I don't want to date myself, from the time we used whiteout. We don't quite use that anymore, so we can't use that for altered records. But there are ways to go in and change things within our systems, and we want to make sure that that's not going to be a viable alternative for someone who's got that little bit of nefarious activity that wants to commit fraud. Unauthorized transactions, repeat audit findings. If you've got a repeat audit findings, you can't throw it under the rug. You have to deal with it. Now, I can't even imagine the years of experience that are in this room in financial aid, because I know some of you, I've talked to some of you, and you have years of experience, and you've got that sixth sense that nobody can teach you. When something comes across your desk, particularly pertaining to an application or something else, and you look at it and you say, something's just not right about this. And you take the time, as our first line of defense, as we've heard us referred to, and you ask those questions so that people can't get by with fraud, with committing things that are not necessarily on the up and up, because your sixth sense, and we really appreciate that as your first line of offense, tells you that just something isn't right about that app or that documentation. And some of the things that jump out of you that we've kind of compiled, the work-study students, you shouldn't let them turn in time cards that reflect time that's more than 24 hours. That just doesn't even make sense. The questionable source, documentation on more than one person from the same source, that's the kind of thing that you look at and says, something's not right about that. Many of you may have distance education courses. We're not in the old days where people actually had to come into the financial aid offices. If you have a student on the phone and you know they're being coached on what they should say, that's probably an indicator that something's completely amiss, particularly if you ask them, what's your birth date? And they say, well, wait a minute, hold on. And you know that they've turned around and asked somebody else what their birth date is, that's potential fraud right there. If they can't respond to normal challenge questions, if they've done just enough academic activity to generate that refund, that's possible that you should look at that and think to ask that next set of questions. And some of the things that we've compiled, we have analytics within the department that I'm not going to share with you at all times, but same email addresses. These are things that are fairly public, and you can probably find within the IFAP website. Street, how many people can live at the same zip code? How many people can live in the same house? Now, we understand IP address is listed on here. We understand that there are instances and that you promote where students go to a financial aid night and they're using the same computers. Okay, we can ferret those out. But come on, 50 people from the same IP address? We're going to take a look at that, as you should. ISER information, similar FAFSA information, and that address change that they have just prior to disbursement, that's probably an indicator that there's little nefarious activity that may be going on, and it's something that we'll hope you take a hard look at to make sure that we don't let the fraudsters in. What can you do? Some of the things we've talked about: documents, shred sensitive information. Tearing a piece of paper in half and throwing it in the trash can is not shredding sensitive information. I'm not going to sit here and say I know the difference between, zigzag shreds versus straight shreds, but just taking a piece of paper and saying, oh, I don't know this anymore, need this anymore, tearing it up and throw it away. No, people are doing dumpster dives to find some of that financial aid information that they need to become someone else's identity. We're starting to get away from the use of Social Security numbers and using more key indicators. Review, again, who has access privileges to your major networks, particularly those that have sensitive information. And again, verify who you're talking to on the phone. Just because a student says, I'm John Doe, ask those questions. It doesn't have to be. Particularly in this day, as I said, of more distance education, more online services, if you have to call them, they may not be the person. The person represented could be a victim of identity theft. And particularly your staff. All of you hopefully have staffs that receive Title IV training. Ensure the staff receives the necessary Title IV training to make sure they know the rules engaged in delivering a financial aid. Question those documents. Verify your authenticity. It's okay to request additional information from students and parents. Yes, parents get very antsy when you ask them a lot of questions, but that's okay. If your sixth sense is telling you that something's not quite right about this, it is completely within your purview to ask them additional questions. And compare information on different documents that are coming in. If something on one document is not adding up to something on the other, it's time to kind of dig into that next step to make sure the information that's provided is current and accurate. Contact the OIG, the Office of Inspector General, if you suspect fraud. As Michael mentioned earlier, we are working with the OIG on many fronts, some of which you know about and some of which you won't, to make sure that we can compare notes, to make sure we can break up potential fraud rings that we've all heard about in the news that try to defraud the government of millions and millions of dollars. We're working to make sure those aren't happening. What happens when you detect fraud? You can call the IG, 1-800, some say misused, some say mis-US-ed, so you can pronounce it any way you want. They also have a hotline that you may or may not be familiar with. If not, take the time to familiarize yourself and make that information available to people in your office, people across your campus. The OIG accepts referrals from all sources. Now you can say, well, wait a minute, we go through compliance reviews. What's the difference in a compliance review and what does the OIG do? We have a fantastic group of reviewers in our program compliance office and in our enforcement office. They come and do their compliance reviews and look at your administrative capacity to see if you're having any violations of the Higher Education Act. They take administrative actions as authorized. They have administrative authority only. They have responsibility to ensure that your program is operating within the proper parameters. They are required, as we are, to send allegations of potential fraud to the OIG. Now, what does the OIG do with these? They have the investigative authority to go after the bad guys. They work with federal authorities, state authorities, police forces. They have the law enforcement authority that we don't have. So when you send allegations to the OIG, they're the ones that can go, gun-toting and all, and find out and make the potential arrest of people who may be committing fraud. Now, they are, as you know, independent of us in exercising their authority, which is a good thing. But we urge you to call the OIG if you suspect fraud to make sure that we can stop the bad guys in their track before they get into or try to get into that $1.5 trillion loan portfolio and defraud our deserving students of money that they need to complete their educations. That's it for me. You can contact any of us. Our email addresses are here. And we'd like to open it up for questions. Any questions out in the audience?
There are mics, Linda. Tell them about the Zoom mics.
Oh, there are mics right there and right there. Come on, not this bunch. You guys are not shy.
Hi. Good afternoon. Is it on? Can you hear me? At yesterday's open forum, I asked a question for the panel, which was about ID and Ed, or V4 and V5 CPS reporting. And when issues are found with identity or issues are found with high school completion status, if they would make that database, well, CPS eventually, if they would develop it to be a searchable database, so schools could use that. Because if we find someone that has an issue with identity or something like that, or they've provided falsified documentation for high school completion status, we usually dismiss them from the university. But for that student to then go to the next school and maybe provide a documentation that looks a little better or looks more accurate, you know, there's no database for us to be able to provide if we're required to report that information anyway for V4 and V5 verification students, for the other schools to see that.
And we recognize that. That's what we call runners, when they run from one school to another. And we do have an initiative that's going on within the department, not just in CPS, but also putting a flag in NSLDS, so that when one student runs from one school to another, that's something that's underway. It's not complete yet, because there are some policy implications about doing that, because, you know, what happens if you flag the wrong student, if you have a false positive, but that is something that we've heard, and we're taking that under advisement, so thank you.
And then one other thing, with the OIG, with referrals made, what we've heard in the past, especially that one-offs, they're not so much interested in as they're looking for the larger fraud populations, especially because I think they're very busy. And so do you have any suggestions about with one-offs? Should we just continue to report them? Or?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Continue to report them. And the OIG, we all have short staffs, but we are working on an analytic program that we can take those one-offs, as you call it, because one-offs, when you start to compile them, become real analytic data. Mm-hmm. So no, do not stop reporting them. They are being funneled into between the OIG and federal student aid. We are mindful of those.
All right, thank you.
My question is related to like Google products, because a lot of schools are going towards using some of those, not just Gmail, but, you know, Sheets, Word, that kind of thing. So is there any particular concerns that schools should be aware of when using those products, when they're sharing maybe student data through those, you know, Google-made items?
No matter what application you're using, you need to make sure you're using the current version and that you always put the patches in place to identify it. You need to ensure that your data is always encrypted, no matter what application you're using. Whether you're transmitting it, it needs to be transmitted encrypted, and whether you're storing it, needs to be stored encrypted. But the big thing is to make sure your patches are in place and you're using the current version.
Thank you.
Hi there. On the topic of keeping and storing passwords, do you have recommendations for safe ways that we can recommend to staff and students to do that? I personally, I will confess, have a 3-page Word document that I do have password protected, but I feel like that's probably not strong enough.
I'm going to take advantage of Jason Gray sitting over there as the department's CIO and refer this question to him because he's the expert. Jason, can I infringe upon you?
I thought you were just going to sit there, right?
I knew I should have left earlier. Whoops. So that's a great question. I think a lot of people do that. They put it there. Sometimes you'll see it in like an Outlook contacts list. There's all sorts of ways. I think as we go towards more different types of authentication, I know with some of the new phones, you've got your fingerprint that you can use. You've got your facial recognition. So I would say that those are going to be more towards the future. I think right now what you're doing is probably a common practice, and I think making sure that that's secured with a solid password that certainly exceeds, the 16 characters and strong encryption or authentication. That would be what my recommendation would be.
Okay.
Don't use the word password as a
No.
password.
Great, thank you.